20th century has produced some of the greatest writers who changed the course of literature. Writers that went on the pursuit of pushing the language to its limits, such as James Joyce, and the writers like Kafka, who mirrored the absurdity of life in which anything can happen at random and only sometimes, or perhaps never, happy ending. And the writer who tried to capture his whole life in a work of fiction such as Marcel Proust. The list is somewhat long, but all in all, these writers are collectively called modernists, who rejected traditional narrative structure and focused on more fragmented writing. In search of subjective reality, abhorring the first-person writing, they embraced stream of consciousness. Instead of beautifully articulated story, they opted for ambiguity and vagueness. In short, it would not be wrong to say that these modernist writers tried to break away from the traditional literary value. And it was during this time in 1919, T.S. Eliot, who himself was a modernist, wrote an essay of remarkable importance on the traditions that even after a century, literature reads and appreciates. So hello and welcome to Literoseious. I'm Yash Purohit, and in this video we will be looking into T.S. Eliot's essay, Tradition and Individual Talent. The essay was first published in literary magazine called The Egoist in 1919 and has considerably impacted the development and shaping of new criticism. Eliot has divided the essay in three parts, which obviously he has not named, but for the better understanding of ourselves, we can say that the first part deals with tradition, the second part deals with impersonality of art, and the last part is the conclusion. Eliot begins the essay with the fact that the word tradition is seldom used to praise or to refer to a writer, and if it is used, it is almost always used in a scornful manner, as the poetry of so-and-so is too traditional. Only in an archaeological sense the word tradition is used in an affirmation. The archaeological metaphor is used to imply that people generally find the idea of something from the past or of a historical significance comforting. Therefore, in this sense, the word tradition may sound agreeable. But the same is not the case in our appreciation of living or dead writers. Eliot writes, when we praise a poet upon those aspects of his work in which he least resembles anyone else, in these aspects or parts of his work, we pretend to find what is individual, what is the peculiar essence of the man. That is to say, we appreciate only the part which is not influenced by the predecessors, and it is that isolated part with which we are more entertained and satisfied. But against this critical tendency, Eliot argues that if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. For Eliot, the word tradition does not have a simple dictionary meaning of passing down or inheriting values and customs to the next generation, which then follows it unintelligibly. Rather, Eliot writes, it cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. For which, Eliot suggests that the poet must write with a historical sense. That is to say, writing should not be done with one's own generation in mind. Rather, it should be done with a feeling that the whole of literature of Europe from Homer and within it the whole of literature of his own country has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. Though Eliot has clearly mentioned the whole of Europe, I would rather take it as an idea that the poet must have an understanding of literary traditions from the very beginning to the time of its own life, for Eliot himself was pretty much influenced by the Indian traditions. In simple words, historical sense is a fusion of past and present. No art can have a complete meaning alone in isolation. They are subjected to contrast and comparison with the dead poets. This should be done not with the point of view of historical criticism, which was kind of prevalent during the period, but rather from the aesthetic standpoint to find the ideal order. All the existing literature forms an ideal order, and when the new work of art is introduced, it is modified and readjusted. The existing monuments, writes Eliot, form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the new, the really new work of art among them. Eliot further adds, past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. It may sound stupid, but to better understand this, we may take an example of Charles Dickens. Though he was one of the most celebrated writers of the Victorian era, majorly his writing lacks the moral ambiguity. His characters are either bad or good, but there is no in between. Now when we compare it with Irish Murdoch, The Sea, a book came after about 2 centuries, we can assert that Murdoch has managed to portray the more realistic characters by showing moral ambiguity, and therefore the new ideal order is created. This is also the major reason why modern readers are gravitated towards Great Expectation more than any other writings of Dickens. Eliot further clarifies the meaning of an artist's connection with the past, that it should not be limited to a certain period or 1 or 2 poets, and also that it does not mean historical facts. Rather, the artist should know the mind of Europe. That is to say, the artist must have the consciousness of the past and the greater sensitivity of historical awareness. Eliot states, some can absorb knowledge, the more tardy must sweat for it. Shakespeare acquired more essential history from Plutarch than most men could from the whole British Museum. This shows a greater historical awareness of Shakespeare than many others. Therefore, Eliot insists artists upon developing the historical consciousness throughout the career. And this continuous process will lead the artist to merge its own personality with the tradition and ultimately to the impersonal art. To explain impersonal art, Eliot gives an analogy of catalyst. When oxygen and sulfur dioxide are mixed in the presence of filament of platinum, sulfuric acid is formed. But this newly formed sulfuric acid does not contain any trace of platinum. Eliot compares the mind of a poet, or the mind of a mature poet I may add, with a shred of platinum. As platinum remains unaffected, the poet's mind must remain unaffected from the creation. Therefore, the poet is but a medium which channelizes the tradition. An artist's mind is a place where all the emotions, feelings, images, phrases are stored and remains there until all the elements required to produce the work are collected. And once collected, they are combined together, which culminates in the formation of a new work of art. Eliot emphasizes on the way in which emotions and feelings are fused together to form a piece of art. It does not matter how strong or intense those emotions are, Eliot states. It is not the greatness, the intensity of the emotions of the components, but the intensity of the artistic process, the pressure, so to speak, under which the fusion takes place that counts. Eliot does not entertain the idea of poetry as an expression of poet's own experiences and emotions, and also he asserts that the job of the poet is not to find the new emotion, rather to use the ordinary ones and in working them up into poetry to express feelings which are not in actual emotions at all. That is to say, to take the ordinary feelings and turn them into poetry, expressing emotions that might not actually be felt in real life. Eliot rejects the romantic idea of emotion collected in tranquility, because poetry is not about remembering emotions calmly, but it is about concentrating on a lot of experiences that happen naturally without any conscious planning. And this natural phenomena makes poetry or a work of art impersonal. Poetry is not about expressing emotions but escaping from it. It is not the expression of personality but an escape from personality. In the final paragraph of the essay, Eliot says that he does not intend to focus on practical advice for the people who admire poetry, but his intention is to divert interest from the poet to the poetry. Doing so will help in better understanding of the good and the bad poetry. Though many people can appreciate expressions of sincere emotion in verse, few can tell when there is an expression of significant emotion that exists within the poem itself rather than in the poet's biography. The emotion of art is impersonal. To achieve this impersonal quality, the poet must surrender themselves to their work. They need to be aware not just of the current moment but also of the past, and not just what's gone but what's still alive in the past.